When my wife and I moved into our new house, we were excited to finally be living in a quiet neighborhood. The area looked like something out of a TV commercial, you know? Well-kept houses, trimmed lawns, kids playing in the street. But as soon as we started settling in, we noticed something odd about the neighbor next door. We never saw him leave. Not to check his mail, mow the lawn, nothing. The curtains were always shut, which honestly was a bit weird. For the first few days, we thought the place might be empty, but at night, we'd hear strange noises coming from there. Heavy footsteps, furniture scraping against the floor, and what sounded like low murmuring. We tried not to think too much about it, telling ourselves maybe he was just a private person. But over time, those sounds got harder to ignore. One night, as we were washing dishes, I happened to glance toward his window. That's when I saw something that sent a chill down my spine. A shadowy figure standing there in the dark, watching us. I couldn't make out a face or anything, just this outline, completely still, almost like he was waiting for us to notice. When I pointed it out to my wife, she looked and saw it too. We stood there in silence, trying to make sense of it. I mean, who stands in their darkened window just staring at their neighbors like that? As much as I wanted to brush it off, something about it just didn't sit right. After that night, his behavior started affecting us more than I'd like to admit. I tried not to dwell on it, but every time we walked by our own window, I got this feeling like we were being watched. My wife started to feel the same way too, and even though we tried to go about our lives as usual, those noises at night just kept getting louder. One night, we heard what sounded like something heavy being dragged across the floor, almost like he was moving furniture or, I don't know, dragging something big around. It was muffled but constant, and the murmuring, that was the worst part. Sometimes, it sounded like he was talking to himself, other times like he was arguing with someone. That started to really get to us. We ended up asking a few neighbors about him, trying to see if anyone knew anything. Strangely, nobody seemed to know much at all. They just kept saying he'd always been there. But that was it. Some of the older folks vaguely remembered seeing him in the past, but it was always the same story. He didn't talk to anyone and rarely left his house. By this point, the neighborhood, which once felt so welcoming, started to feel eerie. It was almost like everyone knew something they just weren't willing to share. One morning, we found something that made things even creepier. When I stepped outside to grab the paper, I noticed a set of footprints in our yard. At first, I thought it might have been an animal, but when I looked closer, I saw they were definitely human footprints, and they led straight up to our bedroom window. It looked like someone had stood there, watching us while we slept. That was enough to make me feel seriously uncomfortable, so I started locking every door and window even during the day. My wife, who had been trying to rationalize his behavior, was visibly shaken. She suggested installing a camera in the yard, but at the same time, we were both nervous about what we might catch. That night, the atmosphere in our house felt heavy. We tried to convince ourselves it was just paranoia, but around 3 in the morning, we heard a sound right outside the window. It was a soft, scraping noise on the glass, like someone was dragging their nails across it. I froze in bed, heart pounding, unsure if I should get up to check. My wife grabbed my arm, equally terrified, and we just lay there, listening to that sound. After a few minutes, it stopped, and everything was silent again. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, we re-watched the footage multiple times, but the quality was too poor to make out any details about the intruder. The creepiest part was how he seemed to just disappear once he got close to the house next door. There were no sudden movements or signs of urgency, just that slow, unsettling way he moved, almost like he knew we were watching. After that, we'd had enough. I called the police, explained the situation, and showed them the footage, but since there wasn't a clear crime happening, they just promised to patrol the area at night. The feeling of helplessness was overwhelming, like we were stuck in some bizarre, never-ending nightmare. But things didn't stop. The following night, just as we were trying to sleep, we heard footsteps close to the window again. This time, with what little courage we had left, my wife and I decided to look. I pulled the curtain back slightly and peeked out, my heart beating so loudly I could barely think. And there he was, the same dark figure, standing in the shadows, watching us in that same intentional way. It felt like he wanted us to see him, as if he was enjoying the fear he was causing. From that point on, our sleep was a mess. Every little noise seemed like him. Every shadow felt like he was watching us again. In a last attempt to keep some sanity, we started sleeping with the lights on, hoping it would keep him away, but the sounds continued. One night, we heard that dragging noise again, but this time, it sounded like it was coming from inside our yard. I didn't have the courage to go check right away, so we just lay there, frozen, as that eerie sound filled the silence of the house. My wife squeezed my hand, whispering that we needed to get out of there. The next morning, I decided to check the yard one last time before making any drastic decisions. To my shock, I found footprints again, but now they didn't just lead to our window. This time, they circled the entire house, forming a nearly complete loop. It was as if he had been pacing around, evaluating, looking at every possible entry point. That was the final straw. We decided we'd leave as soon as possible. Even without any real answers, we felt like staying any longer would be dangerous. We packed up and left within days. I still think about those nights, though. No matter how much time has passed, the memory of that dark figure outside our window, watching, still makes my skin crawl. It's hard to shake off the feeling that he was just playing with us, that maybe he's still there, waiting for the next unsuspecting neighbors to move in. Not long ago, I decided to change my life and leave the city behind. I bought a small piece of land in a rural area, far from everything. The house was modest, but it was just what I needed: peace and some physical work to keep my mind busy. For the first few days, everything was perfect. I'd wake up early, feed the animals, work on the land, and at night, it was just complete silence. At first, it was a bit unsettling, but I quickly got used to the calm and lack of neighbors. Well, almost, except for the old, abandoned house on the hill next to my property. I thought it was just another old building left to rot. Nothing unusual, but soon, strange things started catching my attention. Occasionally, as night fell, I'd notice some unusual movement up there. I'd see lights, like flashlight beams moving quickly, as if they were searching for something. The first time I saw it, I figured it was just some local kids playing a prank or exploring, but it started happening more often. Almost every night, I'd catch glimpses of those lights, and sometimes even shadows moving quickly, as if someone was hiding. I tried to brush it off, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something about that place was off. What really got to me was a conversation with the owner of the local general store. I hadn't even mentioned the house, but out of nowhere, he asked if I'd seen any weird stuff around there. I was taken aback, so I told him about the lights, though I didn't think it was a big deal. His face got serious, and he said the last person who lived there had vanished without a trace. No one knew what happened, and apparently, since then, people around town talked about seeing figures and hearing strange noises from the place. I thought he was exaggerating, but the way he said it left me feeling uneasy. A few days later, something even stranger happened. Early one morning, I opened my door and found a note pinned down by a rock on my doorstep. It had no signature, no name, nothing to say who left it. It was just a crumpled piece of paper with shaky handwriting that said, "Don't look into what's happening in the house next door." I froze, staring at it, trying to figure out if this was some sick joke, or if someone was really trying to warn me. The more I thought about it, the more it felt like an invitation to find out what was really going on up there. Ignoring the warning was tempting. I mean, who wouldn't be curious? So I waited until late afternoon, grabbed a flashlight, and made my way up the hill. The path was steep and overgrown, and with every step, the silence got thicker, almost like it was closing in on me. Up close, the house looked even more decayed, with broken windows and rotting wood. Something about it gave off this heavy feeling, like it was absorbing every bit of light and warmth around. But I kept going, even though every instinct told me to turn back. When I got closer, I realized I wasn't alone. I could have sworn I saw a shadow moving past a window on the second floor, but when I shone my flashlight, there was nothing. The tension was building, but I pushed it down and decided to go in. The door creaked loudly as I opened it, and the smell of mold and rot hit me instantly. Dust covered everything, but I could see fresh footprints on the floor, leading down a hallway to the left. The silence was so deep that I could hear my own breathing echoing back at me. I followed those footprints, trying to stay calm, but my mind was racing, imagining the worst. The hallway was long and dark, and my flashlight barely lit a few feet ahead. Every step made the floor creak louder, almost like it was announcing my presence. When I turned right, I saw something that made me freeze. On the floor was a row of small items lined up, like some kind of makeshift altar. They were small things, but clearly from different times. A broken porcelain doll, an old coin, a pocket watch, all covered with a thin layer of dust. It didn't look like an abandoned collection. It looked like they'd been placed there recently. The worst part was on the wall above these objects. A series of old black and white photos taped up, each showing a lone figure standing, staring straight into the camera. The face was almost always the same, but the background changed. One photo immediately grabbed my attention. It was of my house, taken from somewhere on the hill. The thought that someone had been watching me that closely, without me knowing, sent chills down my spine. I swallowed hard and started to back away, but a muffled noise from upstairs made me stop. It sounded like shuffling footsteps, slow and dragging, going back and forth. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I thought about running, but something, maybe a twisted curiosity, kept me there. I went up the stairs with my flashlight steady in my hand, trying not to make a sound, each step creaking louder than the last. At the top, I found a narrow hallway with several closed doors. The door at the end was slightly open, and a faint light, maybe from a flashlight, spilled out. I took a deep breath and walked toward it, each step heavier than the one before. When I pushed the door open, what I saw inside made my head spin. It was an empty room, except for a single chair positioned in the center, facing the doorway, like it was waiting for someone. Before I could even process what the chair meant, I felt a presence behind me. I didn't hear footsteps, didn't feel anything move, but this cold, heavy feeling filled the room, and a chill ran down my spine. I slowly turned my head, my flashlight shaking in my hand, and there it was. In the hallway, in the shadows, someone, or something, was watching me. The figure didn't have a clear face, just a dark, blurry outline. But the way it stood there, perfectly still, made it feel like it was studying me, observing my every move. Terrified, I backed into the room, keeping my eyes on the figure. But when I glanced back at the doorway, it was gone. The hallway was empty. I took that as my one chance to get out of there. I ran down the stairs, nearly tripping, with my heart racing. When I finally got back to my place, I locked every door and turned off all the lights, like that would somehow protect me. Since that night, I haven't gone near that hill. And I kept the note, a dark reminder that some things are better left in the dark. To this day, I don't know who or what was watching me in that house, but every night, I can't shake the feeling that unseen eyes are still on me. When I first moved into that apartment building, everything seemed normal, almost welcoming. It was a small place with only a few apartments, and the neighbors mostly kept to themselves. On my first day there, an elderly lady who lived next door introduced herself, brought me a homemade cake, and stayed to chat for a while. She seemed friendly, kind of reminded me of my grandmother. At the time, I didn't think twice about letting her in for a quick coffee while I unpacked. Her presence felt comforting, like having someone around in case I needed anything. She told me she'd been living there for years and knew everyone in the building. It seemed genuine, like she really just wanted me to feel welcome. In the first few weeks, she'd pop by now and then with some food or just to say hello. It felt a bit intrusive, but I didn't see any harm in it. Then, her visits started happening at odd hours. Once, she knocked on my door at 5 in the morning, saying she thought she heard noises coming from my apartment and was just worried. Another time, she showed up around 10 at night with a reason that she'd made too much soup and didn't want it to go to waste. I tried to be polite, but I was starting to feel uncomfortable with these unexpected visits, especially so late or so early. The discomfort grew when I started noticing that some of my things weren't quite where I'd left them. The first time, it was a book I'd left on the living room table. The next day, it was on the couch. I thought maybe I'd moved it myself and just forgot. But over time, the feeling that something was off kept growing. Small things like glasses that I was sure I'd put away in the cabinet were on the counter, and decorative items seemed to be slightly out of place. I started wondering if I was being paranoid, or if someone was actually messing with my stuff. That's when I began suspecting the neighbor. She was the only person who occasionally came into my apartment, and her frequent visits made me wary. I started paying attention, even leaving certain things in specific spots just to see if they would move. And, to my surprise, they did. The doubt started eating at me, and I felt scared to think about why someone would do this. One night, I worked up the courage to ask her directly if she had a copy of my apartment key. She stayed silent for a few seconds, and instead of denying it or explaining, she simply smiled and said, "I'm just looking after you, dear." That sent chills down my spine. After that strange encounter, my sense of safety was gone. I started locking every door and window, even pushing a chair against the front door at night, like an extra barrier. But still, the feeling that I wasn't alone in my own apartment wouldn't leave me. She continued to show up, but now it was even creepier because she no longer knocked. She'd just appear out of nowhere, almost as if she knew exactly when I'd be home. One time, I came back and found her standing in the hallway outside my door, just smiling that same unsettling smile and saying she was just checking in to see if I needed anything. I tried to avoid her as much as I could, but it felt like the more I pulled away, the closer she wanted to be. I couldn't relax at home anymore. Every little noise or creak made my heart race. One night, as I was trying to fall asleep, I heard the faint sound of keys in my lock. My body froze. I knew I was locked in from the inside, but the sound was real, like someone was trying to unlock my door. I lay there in complete silence, barely breathing, until the sound stopped. The next day, she greeted me with that same smile and casually mentioned, "Hope you slept well. It was so nice and quiet last night." After that last visit, my sense of security completely crumbled. I started avoiding my apartment as much as possible, coming home late and leaving early just to avoid running into her. But somehow, she seemed to pick up on my routine and started showing up outside the building, coincidentally bumping into me on the sidewalk, like she was always waiting. The feeling was suffocating. I tried to act normal, but my nerves were obvious, and she seemed to thrive on it, always smiling softly with that intense gaze that gave me chills. One of the scariest nights was when I came home to find a pile of freshly folded clothes on my bed, clothes that I had left in the laundry basket. She had washed, dried, and folded them, like some kind of overbearing mother. That confirmed all my suspicions. She definitely had a copy of my key and was coming in whenever she pleased. Even worse, she felt entitled to do it, looking after me in a way that was downright creepy. That was the last straw, and I called the building manager, demanding a lock change. He agreed, but it would take a few days, and those were some of the longest days of my life. In the days leading up to the lock change, I could barely sleep. Every tiny sound would make me jump, and the idea that she could walk in at any moment was unbearable. On the last night before the change, I woke up in the middle of the night to the faint sound of footsteps in the hallway. My heart was racing as I lay there, not daring to move. I heard something being placed outside my door and then a quiet, drawn-out whisper. "I'll always be here to take care of you." I stayed frozen, not sure if it was real or my mind playing tricks, but the fear was overwhelming. The next morning, on my way out to work, I saw a small wicker basket by my door. Inside were a few personal care items like soap and towels, and a short note that read, "So you don't feel alone." I felt a mix of terror and anger. She was invading my privacy, leaving these gifts as if they were tokens of kindness, but it all felt like a twisted way to make me dependent on her. Right then, I knew I had to get out of that apartment, no matter what. I couldn't take the constant feeling of being watched and cared for by this woman. On the day of the lock change, I felt a temporary sense of relief, like I was finally taking back control of my life. I spent the whole day out and only came back late, hoping there would be no trace of her. When I entered my apartment, everything seemed normal, but when I went to my bedroom, I caught a whiff of that familiar sweet perfume she wore. There, in the middle of my bed, was a single red rose and one last note in her neat handwriting. "Locks can change, but I'll always find a way to look after you." Seeing that left me frozen. She knew about the lock change, and yet she'd somehow managed to get in. Or maybe she was just leaving me one final reminder that I'd never truly be rid of her. That same week, I packed up and left the apartment. I grabbed everything I could carry and left the rest behind. I couldn't stay there, constantly looking over my shoulder, wondering if she'd show up again. Even after moving out, I still have nightmares about that woman. Sometimes, I wake up feeling like I can smell her perfume lingering in the air, as if she's still watching me somehow. To this day, I don't know if it was just an obsession or if she had something even darker in mind, but I never got an answer. All I know is that the fear I felt in that apartment is something I'll never forget. When I rented the apartment, I wasn't expecting anything too special. It was an old building, the kind that's seen generations of tenants and still had that scent of aged wood. My space was decent and well organized, but what really caught my attention was a locked door in the corner of the living room that led to the attic. When I asked the landlord about it, he told me the attic was for his exclusive use and that no one else had access to it, so I didn't need to worry. Back then, I didn't think much of it. I was more focused on settling in and making the place livable. For the first few days, everything was fine, but after a few nights, I started to notice some strange things. Little details that could easily be ignored, but, together, started to bother me. One day, I came home from work and saw a food wrapper lying near the attic door. I thought it was odd because I was sure I hadn't left it there. I figured it might have fallen out of one of my moving boxes by accident, so I brushed it off and continued with my routine. But over the next few days, other small things started to show up, objects slightly out of place, and the weirdest thing, a creeping feeling that maybe I wasn't as alone as I thought. After about a week, I started to get really suspicious. I knew exactly where I'd left my things and how I'd arranged the apartment, but every day something seemed just a bit off. One day, I came home to find one of my chairs turned toward the attic door, almost like someone had been sitting there, facing it. That's when my discomfort turned into real fear. I started to wonder if someone was actually using the attic without the landlord's knowledge. The next day, I went to him and asked directly about access to the attic, trying to keep it casual, but he assured me that no one else had a key. That should have eased my mind, but it only made me more uneasy. That night, as I was trying to sleep, I heard a faint noise coming from above, right over my bedroom. It sounded like light footsteps, like someone carefully walking around up there. I held my breath, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. But the sound kept going, soft and steady, until it stopped abruptly, almost as if whoever was up there realized I was listening. I got out of bed with my heart pounding and looked toward the locked door in the corner of the living room. It was still, but somehow it felt alive, like it was hiding something I wasn't supposed to know about. I decided I needed solid proof that I wasn't just being paranoid. The next day, I placed a few small objects, a book and a mug, against the attic door in specific positions so I'd remember exactly where they were. If someone moved them, I'd know. I spent the day out, and when I came back, I felt tense before I even stepped inside. Sure enough, as soon as I opened the door, I saw the mug had shifted and the book was turned upside down. My blood ran cold. There was no way that was an accident, and it only meant one thing. Someone was really going into the attic when I wasn't there. That night, I couldn't bring myself to sleep with the lights off. The feeling of being watched was unbearable, and every tiny noise made me jump. Around 3 in the morning, the noises started again, louder this time, like whoever was up there didn't care about being quiet anymore. My heart raced as I heard the footsteps move closer to the attic door until they stopped right above it. I stayed completely still, trying to make as little noise as possible, terrified that if I moved, whoever was up there would realize I knew they were there. I took a deep breath and decided I needed one final piece of proof to understand what was really going on. I grabbed my phone and started recording, pointing it toward the attic door, hoping to catch any sounds or movements. My hands were shaking, but I stayed still, waiting, listening to every tiny detail. The silence was heavy, until suddenly, I heard a faint creak, like someone was pushing something heavy up there. A chill ran down my spine. For a moment, I thought about yelling or calling the police, but I hesitated. How would I even explain this? No one besides me seemed to know about the intruder. The next morning, I decided I couldn't stay there any longer. I packed up my things as quickly as I could, determined to leave that place as soon as possible, but I wanted to check the attic one last time, just for closure. I went to the landlord and asked for the key, making up some excuse about a plumbing issue. He handed it over, looking a bit suspicious, and with my heart pounding, I climbed the stairs to the attic door. When I opened it, the smell of mold and something rotten hit me immediately, and the space was filled with discarded food containers and clothes scattered around, like someone had actually been living there for days. As I looked around the attic, a sense of dread washed over me like nothing I'd felt before. In a dark corner, there was a filthy mattress, some crushed food cans, and pieces of paper with angry, disconnected phrases scribbled on them. The most disturbing thing I found was a small camera pointed directly at a ventilation hole that faced my bedroom. My heart was racing as I realized that while I was sleeping, someone had been watching me. I couldn't stand to be in that attic for even one more second. I bolted out of there, locking the door behind me. I returned the key to the landlord, unable to hide my nerves. He gave me a puzzled look, but I didn't feel the need to explain. I gathered the rest of my things and left the apartment that same day. To this day, I have no idea who was using the attic, or if the landlord knew more than he let on. I didn't go back to get my deposit, and I don't ever want to find out if someone is still living up there. That experience left me paranoid, and now, every time I move somewhere new, the first thing I do is check every corner of the place. Since moving out, I've realized just how much that experience messed with me. I spent weeks struggling to sleep, always feeling like someone was watching me, even in a new place. Every now and then, I'd get flashes of that camera pointed at my bedroom, wondering how many nights that stranger sat up there, watching every move I made. The scariest part was realizing they could have come down to my apartment anytime while I was sleeping, without me even knowing. Not knowing who they were or what they wanted has left me constantly on edge. What still haunts me to this day is that I never got any real answers. I don't know if the landlord knew more than he was saying, or if he genuinely believed no one was using the attic. But the uncertainty, that nagging doubt that maybe this happens in more places than we think, has stuck with me. Whenever someone asks about that time, I give them a quick summary, but I don't go into detail. It's not something I like to revisit, but it's something I can't forget. Even now, whenever I hear any noise coming from above, I can't shake the fear that somewhere up there, someone is still watching.